So let's talk about those 2 time lapses. So a couple days ago, I shared 2 time lapses. One of the time lapses came from the GoPro Hero 11, and the other time lapse came from the DJI Osmo Action 3. Now when I shared the video, I didn't tell you which time lapse came from which camera, because I wanted to give you the opportunity to guess, and also to tell me which one you liked best. So those of you that participated, thank you. I appreciated your feedback and your guesses on that. So what I'll do in today's video is I'm going to go through both time lapses and I'm going to watch through those and I'm going to tell you along the way what I like and don't like about both of them. And then I'm going to tell you what I do to address the things that I don't like about those time lapses, because as a reminder, those time lapses were both filmed in video mode with these cameras and both of the same settings were plugged into each of these, but as you can see, the results varied by quite a bit in some aspects. There are a few things about each of those time lapses that I think all of us can agree are not the best. But then there are plenty of things about those time lapses that are pretty incredible, considering they came out of little cameras like this with pretty small sensors in there. And to be fair, having these cameras facing the sun for a sunset is not the easiest lighting to work with, because that sun is low in the sky, it's very bright, and it's lining up with these cameras and shining right into those tiny little sensors. So let's get started. Let's take a look at those time lapses over here on the computer. And I'm going to tell you as we go along what I like and don't like about each of those. Let's get started on time lapse number 1. I've got it up right here. All right, so first thing I see right away here that I don't like about this time lapse is this lens flare-ish pattern that's around the outside and also right in this area above the sun. And then of course, kind of a hazy pattern down here. So this camera definitely did not handle that lighting the best. There was quite a bit of flare and distortion there. And that continues on for a little while here until the sun gets a little lower in the sky, and then it gets a little bit better. Now the other thing I didn't really like about this time lapse is the clouds over here. They're kind of soft, blurry. There's not really a lot of detail in those clouds. The highlights are pretty overblown. Both of them had that EV comp set to lower than 0 to help offset that with the clouds. But even with that, it was still pretty blown out. The trees here also seem to be lacking quite a bit of definition. They're kind of there, but they're a little fuzzy. So I didn't like that about this one. But as we go a little further here, I like it that it captures the rays of the sun here. You can kind of see those. And then when this cloud deck enters, there is quite a bit of detail missing from these clouds. They are kind of fuzzy and they blend together. But I actually kind of like that with this time lapse, because it gives kind of a dreamy effect and it's kind of smooth there. It flows really nicely, so I do like that. And another thing in general I like about this time lapse is the colors look pretty good on here. So I do like the coloring on here. It also captured the sundog here. I forgot to mention that earlier. That was cool to see that there. So we're gonna let this progress a little further now. The colors and the rays of the sun, those continue to look good. I really like how those look. And the colors continue to look good here. Nice blues in this. And I feel like those are an accurate depiction of what the colors actually look like. So whenever the sunset time lapse comes to an end, one of the things to watch is to look at the footage and see how grainy it gets. So there's a little bit of grain and noise here in the footage, but it's not terrible. It's pretty tolerable here. I don't really see any major issues with that. Again, these are tiny little sensors. They can only do so much as they lose their lighting. You can kind of see a little bit of banding here too. That's common with smaller sensors, and also when it's 8-bit color versus 10-bit, there can be a little bit of that shading there. Maybe GoPro and DJI will make 10-bit available in time-lapse video mode at some point. That would be great. So we're gonna let this one finish up now. Colors looked really nice there. And I like it how the fade to darkness is nice and smooth and gradual. You don't see any of that flicker there. The flicker can be a common thing to see there, but I didn't see that with this one. So that was great to see. All right, let's start time-lapse number 2. All right, time-lapse number 2. First thing I noticed right away, this one is a lot warmer and more yellow looking. So both of these cameras were set to 6500K white balance, which is a good white balance for that time of day. However, this one definitely made it look a lot more yellow than the first one did. That can be fixed later on. When you put it into a video editing program, you can fix the white balance by selecting something in your frame that you know was white, and usually you can do it with one click and it'll adjust the rest of the clip. So in this case, if I was to click something white, I would probably select somewhere up in these clouds here. Those ones were pretty reliably white in this frame. Speaking of clouds, what I do like about this one is there is a lot more definition in those clouds there. On the first one, it was very soft and kind of all blended together, but there are patterns in these clouds that can be seen pretty well, and the sundog also stood out nicely. Now, of course, where the sun actually is, it's going to be blown out. Even with that lower EV comp, that's just going to happen because it still cannot handle that. The sun is way too bright for that. But this one I feel like did the clouds a lot better. There's a lot more detail there. The trees also, you can see a lot more detail in the trees, so I do like that about time-lapse number 2. Again, the sundog still shows pretty good there. Lots of definitions in the clouds. This one I liked it with the rays. I feel like the rays and the shadows from those stood out more in number 2. And this cloud deck, when it moves in, there's definitely a lot more detail there in the clouds that stands out. So I do like that. And here the rays continue to look good. The colors do look better here. They look more natural to what they actually look like. And down here where this mountain is, I like being able to see that in more detail. And the definition of the clouds around it, really like how that looks. We're gonna advance this as it starts to fade. Now time-lapse number 2 suffers from the same challenges as time-lapse 1. There is some of this banding you can see here, which is typical in 8-bit footage. And also with the tiny sensors here, when they start to lose light, they start to have a tougher time accurately depicting what's happening. So we're getting that fade to darkness coming here. And I'm watching for the grain and the noise. All right, right about as we get there, it starts to get pretty grainy and noisy. The grain and noise here is noticeably worse than with time-lapse number 1. Especially right in here. Like that starts to get pretty bad. The colors look good, but there is quite a bit of grain and noise there. And now as this one fades to dark, there's some flickering going on there. Time-lapse number 1 did not have the flicker. It was a nice smooth transition to darkness. This one's got a little bit of the flicker, the jumping in it. You can see it a little bit more there, then it fades to darkness. All right, so which time-lapse was which? Let's talk about that. You might be surprised by the answer, or you might not be surprised by the answer, depending on what you guessed. Time-lapse number 1 was from the DJI Osmo Action 3. So congratulations to those of you that guessed that correctly. And time-lapse number 2 was from the GoPro Hero 11. So as I mentioned, there were plenty of things that I liked and didn't like about both of those. Now, what I want to talk about here is how to address those things that I didn't like, and to get as good of a time-lapse as possible out of your camera. So the first one, if you want to edit your time-lapse later on and you want to get the very best results, you should use the photo mode for time-lapse and not the video mode that I used here. The video mode is great on both of these, and it does do a good job with time-lapses, but you are still limited with the results you can get. With photo mode, especially with the raw photos from each of these, your time-lapse is going to have a lot more flexibility, and you can get a lot better results if you're willing to do that. But it should be noted, the editing process involves needing to edit usually a couple thousand photos, and then you have to put those photos together in a video editing program and export them. So it does take quite a bit more time. You're not just gonna have a time-lapse ready to share right out of the camera. And if you do want to see my process for how I edit time-lapses that were done using photo mode, I've linked to that in a video above. It takes you through step-by-step of everything I do. But if you do want to stick with the video mode, and you don't want to do a lot of editing later on or any editing, then I've linked to the 2 videos that I released with each of these cameras, where I go through the best settings for no edit footage. And there's a table of contents for each of these. and you want to skip ahead to the time-lapse section. In that time-lapse section, I show you the best settings that I use on both of these cameras to get the very best time-lapse. With that being said, I think there are two issues, one with each of these right now, that I don't think will be resolved no matter what settings you put into there. And I've done a lot of trial and error with both of these cameras. So the time lapses I did for this video, for instance, are part of that trial and error. I've tried different settings, I've used a lot of defaults, and I keep a checklist where I can narrow down what I like and what I don't like each time I do time lapses. But the thing I didn't like about both of these, time lapse number one, that I don't think can be fixed necessarily, is there's not a lot of detail in the clouds, and there's not really a lot of detail on the ground either. Everything kind of blends. It is a little bit softer, and you're not able to change the sharpness level on the Osmo Action 3. So on the Hero 11 Black, I had it set to low sharpness, and on here, I can't change the sharpness. But even with the low sharpness on the Hero 11 and the whatever sharpness on here, there was still a lot better definition in the clouds and the foreground with the trees there. And overall, it looked a little bit sharper, but not too sharp out of the Hero 11. So I did like that. So with the Osmo Action 3, that's one thing you won't be able to fix most likely with the settings. DJI may release another firmware update that could address some of that. That being said, I don't feel like it was a deal breaker. I did still like how that time lapse looked overall, and the softness wasn't too extreme, so I didn't really have any major issues with that. But that is something to note. Even with those best settings, it's still going to have that certain level of softness to it. The big thing I didn't like about the Hero 11 is at the end of the time lapse, when it faded to darkness, we had two things going on that I didn't like. I didn't like the graininess and the noise there, and I didn't like that flicker. So that flicker is something that I have seen on and off with GoPros. I do think GoPro has addressed that on previous models with firmware updates eventually. For instance, on the 10, I used to have that problem, and then a couple months into owning it, after updating the firmware, the flicker went away, and the noise also got better at the end of the sunset time lapse. So I suspect GoPro is probably going to release some type of fix with a firmware update, if I had to guess. Now, I don't know if GoPro has that on their radar, but I'm hoping they do, because it would be nice to have that nice smooth fade again at the end, and it would be nice to not have all of that noise there. And the other thing I encourage you to do is play around with the angle of the cameras a little bit. So when you have them doing a sunset time lapse, you can mess with the angles here, depending on how you're framing your shot. And you also can mess with how they're placed this way relative to the sun. So that lens flare issue that I had going on with the Action 3, you can fix that sometimes by playing a little bit with the angle of this. But at the same time, you have to remember you still have the sun moving in the sky as it sets. So what you initially set up could look good, but as the sun moves, it could make some of that lens flare again. So keep that in mind. The GoPro, I didn't really have any problems with that. When I do time lapses, that tends to work pretty well. And finally, the other thing I will note when it comes to time lapses, and especially sunset time lapses, is don't always feel limited to having the camera facing the sun while it sets. Sometimes the colors and the patterns in the sky opposite the sun can look just as cool or cooler. I've done plenty of time lapses, including sunset ones, where I focused on the opposite sky and got some incredible results. So play around with it. Like I said, you're not limited to just facing the sun. And when you're not facing the sun, it's a little bit easier to work with that lighting because you don't have the sun shining right into the lens. Instead, the sun is at the back of the camera. And as I've talked about before, that is some of the best lighting when you're using small sensored cameras like these. But with all of that being said, these two cameras still are great choices for doing time lapses, especially for the price and the size of these. They're very versatile. You can have them out there. You can have them getting wet. Of course, if you're running them for several hours, do make sure you have a power pack like these here to power the camera, because the batteries will not last more than a couple hours when doing a time lapse. For these time lapses, I used my trusty Anker external battery packs. They worked great. They powered the cameras plenty long. If you don't have an external power pack for your GoPro or your DJI yet, I've linked to the ones that I use in the description below. You can check those out. I hope you found this video helpful. I hope you have a great time with these cameras shooting time lapses.